came out of his campaign?
FDR as a campaigner was quite phenomenal. Sure, we're back pre-television and basically pre-radio. Not much used during the 32 campaign or before. He got out to see people. Quite often presidential candidates, Harding, for example, sat on his front porch. Hoover did not campaign in the whistle stop sense. I don't know where the word whistle stop was invented, but it certainly could have been invented with FDR. He got on a train and talked to people. They stopped in town, village, wherever there was a crossroads, and he often made 20 appearances in a day. And maybe there were a few hundred people, maybe there were a few thousand, but people saw him, and he radiated this energy and vitality. Mind you, locked into steel braces, held up on the arms of his son, James Roosevelt, or somebody else, but primarily James Roosevelt, and waving his hat, saying some pretty well-worn terms. If you have to give a little 2-minute, 3-minute talk 20 times a day, the same old jokes about his little son, James, who was taller than he was, bald head and all that sort of thing. It sounds rather ordinary, but people were captivated and sensed that dynamic personality and cottoned to it immediately.
I'm going to shift now to the politics, practical politics, once he's in the White House. And I want to ask you why Eleanor Roosevelt became this strong supporter of an anti-lynch law when the president just consistently refused to support it. What did this reveal about this political partnership?
The anti-lynch law in this day and age, of course, sounds like pretty rudimentary, elementary kind of legislation to prohibit lynching. Seems obvious, but at the time it wasn't. The voters in the South, the white voters, were really hot against this anti-lynch legislation. It was the Civil War, the North-South hostility recreated. Now, this was really before you got anything resembling the civil rights movement that we know in post-World War II and in the 60s and from then on. And very little to do with it. But for FDR, it was a very real problem because of the dominance of all the people whose cooperation he needed in Congress. They were all Southern Democrats, all of whom would have had their heads handed to them by their constituencies had they supported an anti-lynch bill in Congress. So,
what was Eleanor pushing for? What was motivating her?
Eleanor Roosevelt was immediately touched by the human element of people being lynched, which is a violence outside the law. After all, we do still have capital punishment in a lot of states in the U.S.
Can you just say that again without the reference to capital punishment? It kind of confuses things. And I think her passion for this is important. You just said that she was...
Yeah, I was just thinking of the name of she or Eleanor Roosevelt. Yeah. Eleanor Roosevelt was very passionately concerned with the injustice on a wide range of social issues, but the flagrant injustice and the violence involved with lynching really revolted her. And she, in her head, understood FDR's position of between a rock and a hard place regarding this Southern Democratic control in the Congress. They were Democrats, to be sure, but Anti-lynching law, there was nothing Democratic or Republican. It just wasn't going, they were not going to let it happen. And so he let her express his true feelings. And she campaigned strongly for it. One of the few instances where she didn't hold back. And he was simply had to say to these Southern Democrats in Congress, I'm sorry, I can't dictate what Eleanor says. And she, of course, used the media, used every access that she had. And the black population in this country, then called Negroes, got the message that Mrs. Roosevelt, anyway, was solidly behind their campaign. Walter White, the then executive director of the NAACP, was keenly anxious to push FDR into this legislation. And FDR had to fend him off, and he was just too busy quite often to see Walter White.
How did FDR feel about Walter White? What kind of person did he see him as? Did he want to meet him? Did he want to spend time with him?
Not particularly. I knew Walter White a little later on. But I can see why FDR wouldn't want naturally to see Walter White. Walter White was a pusher for a cause, a very good cause. And if he hadn't been a pusher, he wouldn't have been an executive director of the NAACP. But it was not what FDR needed or wanted. And it was useless to explain the political realities to somebody like Walter White, whose job it was to push legislation that was doomed to failure. And it was.
Why did FDR finally agree to meet Walter White then at the White House? He did come in and he did give him an audience. What was behind FDR's agreeing to do that? What do you think transpired?
I think Walter White just wore him down, and I think my grandmother wore him down. I think there was also, that probably as a politician, he appreciated Walter White's position. He had to get back to his constituency and say, yes, I have met the president. Now, from what I've just said, you would know that that didn't mean anything in terms of getting that anti-lynch legislation passed, but at least Walter White's constituency would know that he wasn't without access to the president. And that was important for FDR to have it known that he wouldn't avoid seeing Walter White.
Did FDR believe that an anti-lynch law was desirable?
Oh, absolutely. No.
FDR, can you just start by saying FDR?
FDR was in complete concurrence that he had no, he felt just as strongly about the injustice as my grandmother did, but he couldn't express it. That type of violence was as much an abhorrence to him. It has nothing to do with being liberal or conservative. Many conservatives are indeed conservative regarding violence. I mean, they don't like any kind of violent expression of political or social action like that.
Then what stopped FDR? I'm trying to get you to talk about it not being politically rife and how FDR understood that it wasn't.
Yeah.
So did he believe in this?
We should hold for this sermon for just a
Okay,
minute.
what's that? I just, what did FDR understand about the political rightness of this issue?
The anti-lynching law was really the first of what you might call civil rights legislation. Discrimination, I mean, you can hardly call lynching and classify it as discrimination. It's just plain old violence. But the whole racial issue was not on, politically speaking, like something that isn't ripe compared to a number of other issues like Social Security, National Labor Relations Act, etc. the race issue didn't come into its own until after World War II. And for me, I don't even classify the anti-lynching law as part of the race relations. It became increasingly apparent that discrimination took place. But look, I can remember as a teenager in Washington, D.C., living at the White House in December of 1944 and getting on a bus and absent-mindedly sitting down in the back of the bus and the bus driver stopping, telling me to please move forward, and the black people in the bus howling with laughter. Washington, D.C. was a Jim Crow town all through World War II. Now, we're back in the 30s. However, there was one instance where it came up, and my grandmother's feeling about the issue was very strong. It came up in relation to Marian Anderson. Actually, FDR took quite a risk, politically speaking, by allowing his wife to speak as freely and as strongly, stridently, as she did about the about lynching. Because everybody knew that if he really wanted to say, "I cannot have you speaking on this issue," she would have subsided. But he gave her complete and free rein. But it was a nice subterfuge, but it was a subterfuge with considerable risk for FDR. It could have backfired. However, it was handled, he played the usual game, handling it with humor, but, can't control my missus type routine. But it was a marvelous example of that partnership where he was willing to take those risks, but how else could he have taken that risk without a wife who was as recognized as Mrs. Roosevelt was around the country?
Right. What brought your grandmother to resign from the DAR? What were the circumstances? How did she feel when they had excluded Marian Anderson from the White House, from the Constitution Hall?
Well, the Daughters of American Revolution were known for rather conservative views, but they were direct descendants of the Pilgrim Fathers. And through several lines in the family, we are entitled to belong to the DAR. I mean, I'm not a daughter of the American Revolution, but my grandmother was and belonged. A situation arose where the DAR, which had a lovely hall in Washington, D.C., and the hall had booked a concert by the noted contralto Negro Marian Anderson. And the DAR unilaterally withdrew the invitation, clearly on racial lines. My grandmother's response, since it hit the public press immediately, was to resign and state publicly and openly and with obvious anger why she had resigned from the DAR, and then took steps to get Harold Ickes, who's as Secretary of the Interior, would be the official person in charge of public places like the Lincoln Memorial. Washington and Jefferson, Jefferson wasn't built at the time, and to strongly endorse and press him. It needs to be said that Harold Ickes was immediately keen to do this. He had been a long supporter. She endorsed Eleanor.
I'm just going to, if you could just wait for Susan to sit down.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. My grandmother urged and endorsed the Interior Department to give the space of nothing less than the Lincoln Memorial to Marian Anderson perform, and no less than the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, introduced her. And if I recollect, they had expected a few...
Oops. Okay, just let Susan sit. Great.
And here's another example of FDR taking a political risk. But he was capable of taking a risk when it was worth it. And it wasn't just idealism. You know, my grandmother could function under pure idealism. He was the elected official, President of the United States, and always was balancing what he could do and what he couldn't do, and constantly pushing in the idealistic direction, but definitely soft pedaling when it was necessary. In this instance, he felt he could go all the way, and the Secretary of the Interior provided the Lincoln Memorial for Marian Anderson.
Wonderful. Now, could you talk about one more case where your grandfather did act, and this will be in a different show, so you shouldn't do too much back and forth, but when A. Philip Randolph comes and essentially threatens to march on Washington unless there's an executive order ending discrimination in defense industries, where the government money is being spent for armaments, Randolph is asking that blacks and whites be hired. Why is your grandfather able to do that? It's wartime, it's an executive order. Why is he able to act? Can you tell me that story and how he would?
I think FDR acted with great political courage at the time, although you look back upon it and it seems a rather meager and obvious step. But he was still hidebound by the dominance of the Southern Democrats in the senior positions in committees in Congress. But it was an executive order, and there was no question that the country was mobilized, which included everybody. And he felt he could get away with it. He felt that this is a risk I can take. Now, A. Philip Randolph was a very shrewd man. He may have been president of a relatively small trade union, but he was a very bright and able person. And so when he threatened this march on Washington, I suspect that he knew there were two sides of the coin. One, a march on Washington is not something the president wanted. On the other hand, it could have worked against the blacks in this country for a disruptive sort of, even I'm sure the word of fifth column would have been used at the time had the march been carried out. So in a way, FDR used the threat of the march to both their advantages, that he could respond to this threat by this executive order.
Wonderful, that's great. Okay, can we stop for a second?
Most films
Sorry,
that...
I'm just going to ask you to let Susan sit down.
Okay, I can begin. Again. Most films that I've seen on the Depression, or any on the early stages of labor organization, immediately moved to the violence. And there was violence, no doubt about it. But it really did not dominate the scene as the film footage would indicate. Go back to the conception of the NRA was the partnership among the owners and the workers, the managers, etc. This was the original notion. Now, indeed, it began to break down, as any of the trade union people would say. Well, as soon as management gets a little bit of a leg up, their orders beginning to flow again, then we get the short end of the stick because we're not able to bargain. Labor was not able to bargain. They didn't have a right to bargain, and this was the critical issue. And they were just shoved around. And this was the long tradition. If you owned something, and private property was sacred, to some degree still is in this country. And in a certain way, the right to bargain is a restraint against that complete exercise of private property.
What did your grandfather fear about the potential for violence during this very terrible time?
You had a potential for violence across the country in pockets of people who were out of work, starving, at least if, very hungry, unable to bring anything home to their families, and perhaps even without shelter. So you had that potential for violence, but the trade union movements, particularly what we now call the industrial unions, were highly vulnerable. The craft unions were a little less vulnerable. They were the traditional unions of the AFL. They were, by the very nature of their being a craft, more recognized, whereas the industrial unions were straightforward factory workers saying, we want our piece of the pie, and we want some security in our job situation, and we want the right to organize so that this is not just something you give us, you management give us when it's good times.
Personally, what were your grandfather's feelings about violence in a social setting? How did he react to violence?
He had a strong,
Say FDR.
FDR had a very strong feeling against violence. And I think you have to recognize that that would be mainstream thinking. It's not exceptional. Most people in this country, we're really against violence. It isn't that violence is, we're devoid of violence, and many historians would say we've got a lot of violence in our past, but the kind of organized... FDR's response to violence was not exceptional, but his thrust and his instinct was for people to work it out together on a pragmatic basis, mediation, conciliation, this type of thing. He saw, therefore, the right to organize as a means to avoid violence, because if you had a right to get in and talk about the situation, even a right to organize a strike, it can be a peaceful strike. Both my grandmother and grandfather were not keen on the sit-down strike because that had a sense of violence. You were occupying the plant. And there's now legislation against that. But it was for a time a rather effective means of shutting down a place. And at the time, for a short period, the only weapon that organized labor that didn't have the right to organize could take. Anyway, he still didn't support the Wagner National Labor Relations Act because the feeling was very strong against it, and FDR was still courting business for a very simple political expediency. The effect on the economy that lack of hope, lack of investment in very practical terms on the part of business. If business didn't feel reasonably good about the economy, they wouldn't invest. There'd be no new orders, no potential inventorying, etc., all of the things to get the economy open. And he felt very, very keenly that the feelings and forces in Congress were not quite right yet. This is that political sensitivity he had for a National Labor Relations Act. And poor Mr. Wagner was left fighting this battle alone, well, he had a few other people like Bob La Follette and others, the traditional liberals in the Senate and the House. But FDR was quite happy to take the credit for the National Labor Relations Act, but in fact, he gave it relatively little support because he was still wishing to be not an enemy of business.
Who directed the politics of labor? Was that Frances Perkins? How did
Oh, Frances Perkins did not direct the politics of labor. In fact, she had only some modest relations. It was FDR in the White House that carried on the major relationship with the trade unions. She was a little bit like Cordell Hull was at the State Department, often left out of the major movements. Hull was with foreign policy, and she was to some degree. Now, she knew what was going on, but she had a department to administer, and most of the trade union leaders would prefer to deal with the White House than with the Secretary of Labor in any administration. Maybe there's an element of she was a woman. There may well be some subtle element in that, but it was the White House with whom they dealt. But not all of labor. One of the most conservative forces in the country was the AFL, headed by Mr. Green, who was not particularly pro-New Deal and no particular supporter of FDR. FDR's greatest strength with the trade unions was with the industrial unions, the budding industrial unions and the steel workers, auto workers, and the mine workers. And that's the exception, because John L. Lewis and the mine workers was a thorn in FDR's side.
Why? What was it about John L. Lewis that made him hard for FDR to work with?
To put it in simple human terms, John L. Lewis was a rival for popular opinion, for popular support with FDR. And under other circumstances, John L. Lewis might very well have started a third progressive party. He was a political rival, whereas the other trade union leaders were not. He had the capacity to enthrall an audience, and he, in the same way as an Upton Sinclair and some of the others, where he had a strong appeal. However, he created as many enemies as he had friends. But he was often at odds with FDR. He supported the New Deal, and finally he broke with FDR.
Could you just, again, very succinctly tell me that labor politics were directed from the White House, not from the Department of Labor? I mean, just...
Okay, as succinctly. When it came down to the politics of dealing with the trade unions and their support and so forth, it was the White House which dealt with the trade unions, not the Department of Labor.
Right. Tell me about, what was it that the CIO labor leaders delivered to the president? Why was he so willing to work with them? Why did they become such an effective coalition?
Oh, you'd have to go back to the 1920s when early labor legislation was pending. Basic things like child labor, women who were working 60 hours a week in sweatshops and the outlawing of sweatshops, and quite elementary things, a little bit like the stage the lynch law was in relation to the potential race laws. And FDR was involved with that, and even more so, Eleanor Roosevelt was involved with that legislation, going back to the times when she worked with the League of Women Voters and then in New York State in the Democratic Party there. So it has a long, long history. The development of, you might say, the franchise of the modern trade union, FDR gets credit for it, And it was during his administration, and it was to some degree to the encouragement and support that he gave the trade unions. And you also have to look at the other side. Major industry hated his guts for it.
You want to tell me something about Sidney Hillman and the role he played? How did FDR work with Hillman as a kind of go-between? And there's this famous phrase, "clear it with Sidney." Can you sort of say how that developed?
FDR always thought in political terms, even when he was his most idealistic. There was like an underground channel, or maybe the major channel, thinking in what's in it politically. He saw that through the industrial unions there were a lot of voters, and they were across the board, and they were not tied up conservatively like the craft unions were, protecting their turf. And he got a block of votes, part of the coalition, which is called Roosevelt's coalition, that existed right through the 1950s as something the Democrats could quite often count on.
What was the phrase, "clear it with Sidney"? Can you repeat that phrase and tell me what it was about? What was this role that Hillman had?
Sidney Hillman would be an example of the kind of trade union leader that is the kind of politician that FDR could work with and trusted. And there was a phrase in the White House, "clear it with Sidney," that had to do with any political move that might have affected FDR's position, congressional legislation, elections, whether they would be in a particular state, or FDR's own presidential election. "Clear it with Sidney" meant that this is my man in the labor movement where I want you to go for political decisions.
I want to shift now to the court reorganization, because I think that some of the labor legislation was really what FDR saw at risk that made him propose the court reorganization. Can you talk some about the threat to the New Deal that the court posed?
I need to know from you.
You want to stop for a second? Sure. So that Susan sit. Okay. What was this threat posed by the court?
When the court took that individual decision, one could anticipate a domino effect and the rest of the New Deal going down the drain, because NRA was invalidated, including labor's right to organize as part of that total picture. And it worried everybody because they could see 4 years of legislation, literally a revolution accomplished through the legislative process, or on the way to being accomplished, going down the drain. And FDR was flush with the victory of that 1936 election, where only Maine and Vermont held out their electoral votes. And I mean, it was an extraordinary.
So you're going to pick up with that.
Yeah. FDR was flush from his political victory in the 1936 election, an extraordinary thing with only Maine and Vermont holding out, and the rest of the country, through their electoral college votes, in favor of the president. More of a victory than either FDR or any of his advisors thought possible. And I think I would guess that it created a certain overconfidence. And when you had this potential disaster of all of the work that had been done to put the New Deal together in the first term of office, his mind turned to a rather radical change, and he referred to the old men on the court. He held off, but people speculated about this. and the tension built up between him and the Chief Justice, Charles Evans Hughes, and the rest of the justices, the 9 old men, as they were known as. And they were a stubborn lot, but they could very well have, on legal grounds, invalidated the New Deal and most of the legislation. In my view, FDR made an error in the grounds that he chose to pack the court, as it was then called. Actually, it was simply that when a justice reached, what was it, age 75, something of the sort, another justice would be added to relieve the workload. Well, this really was inept. Whether he meant to be inept or not, one never knows. Most people, historians, refer to the disaster of the FDR's position on this. But as some would point out, FDR got what he wanted because the Supreme Court stopped invalidating and shifted its grounds. Same old 9 old men started thinking along new lines, even though, well, I guess we better not. So the pressure he put on the court was effective. I think FDR lost a certain popularity. Who knows? He still was extremely popular. But the failure is often overplayed because the practical result was that the whole New Deal didn't go down the drain. That was the end of it.
Okay. I need to cut for a second, I'm sorry. What kind of political gamesmanship did it take to get the Social Security legislation? What was being debated? What was the vision of Social Security?
Social Security was to be a very wide and intricately knit safety net for the elderly. It was to provide something which had been provided by the extended family prior to that, and that whole scene was changing into grandmothers and grandfathers, even older, who no longer lived with their families, and who were therefore ending up on the dole and relief in a very unsatisfactory way, creating whole other sets of social problems. So as the bill was conceived, it covered a number of facets, including things such as the payment of health care when you get older, which is very much with us today. But it was a marvelous example of how FDR was willing to trim his sails here and there based upon the winds that were blowing in order to get a basic bill, not all that was desirable, but a basic bill through Congress. Somebody better acquainted with the details than I am could outline it, but I do know that the politics surrounding it was intense, and it was often not what FDR believed in here and didn't believe in there, etc. It was to some degree dictated by strong political opposition, and where there was strong political opposition, he had to back off. So the bill went through, and it was landmark legislation, but it was a far cry from what had been introduced.
I'd like to shift now to FDR's agricultural policy, and just have you talk about FDR's ideal of the family farm, how he wished it could be there. He wished it could have stayed part of the American scene, but he also saw that it wasn't there, and so he had another goal for agriculture. What was it in FDR's background and his love of a certain style of life that gave him an attachment to the family farm?
When Franklin D. Roosevelt registered to vote, he gave his occupation as farmer. we had a farm at Hyde Park. It's where I grew up. And there were tenant farmers on a pretty big 2,000-acre estate. He had an affinity for the small farm, which was very prevalent, certainly in New England. And he would have loved to have seen a reverse migration. That is, instead of having the young people leaving the land and going to the cities, he would have loved to have seen them come back into a family farm, small farm operation. That certainly would have been his desire and his dream, but it wasn't on. And he, while he engaged in a lot of fancies, a lot of time, he very quickly got down to what was politically real. And what was politically real was the stabilization of agricultural prices, farm prices. It was a major cause of the Depression staying depressed.
Great. Okay, I need to cut now for a second.
Stick it.
How would you describe the second term by comparison with the 100 days that we talked about before? How would you describe that second term?
In a sense, as a prelude to the second term, FDR was paring the budget, paring relief, paring works programs, all of the things that were essential parts of the New Deal, because he was afraid that he would be hung up politically by his opposition on having spent so much money. So he wanted to come into something close to a balanced budget. And as it turned out, he was not under quite the political threat, although that was the major thing thrown at him by the Republican Party, was the spending of money. He moves into the second term, and it's all the old problems all over again. And there are a couple of things that are clearly evident. Not only the budgetary problems, and he had to continue cutting the budget, because from the initial lift of the economy towards the end of the first term, within a few months, it was back into the same level of depression, practically, that it was when FDR took office, as if nothing had been done. It hit FDR psychologically at a very poor time. Not only was he having the trouble with the court and the threat of everything being invalidated, the whole thing coming undone, but he'd been through 4 years of fighting with with Congress, the kind of applying of pressure, cajoling people, passing out just a little patronage and so forth to get the legislation greased and on the ways. And mind you, in the second term, he had very little patronage. It had already been extended in the first term. So he didn't have that as a lever to work with. And I think to some degree he was tired of a game that he'd played over and over and over. He liked the broad game of politics forever and ever, all his life. But it was that particular part of the game of maneuvering with Congress. And I think it began to pall on him a little bit. And one final factor, fairly obvious one, it wasn't the first 100 days. He'd been in office for 4 years, and this was his 5th year in office. And any politician begins to pale a little bit, doesn't have quite that pizzazz. And while the conditions were exactly the same, there was not a chance of hitting Congress with the kind of legislation that he did in the first 3 months of 1933.
Succinctly, how would you characterize the second term? What would you describe the mood of the whole administration going into the second term? I'm asking you to repeat, but be more succinct.
I'll have to pick that up. The next roll.
Yes, we talked.
How would you describe that second term?
The whole second term for FDR, and really for the government, was very different from the first term. A lot of that energy was lost just to the passage of time, and for some, and I think for FDR, a real agony. They seem to have lost their touch to some degree. FDR went through long periods of kind of an omission, of not pushing things. He wasn't quite as capable, it seemed, of cajoling and maneuvering the key congressman as he'd been in the first term. And in fact, as if for relief, he turned to foreign policy. There was I think for him it's not unfair or inaccurate to say that it was an agony.
Tell me about the pressure on him to cut the budget, to balance the budget, to not have a deficit that led to what we now call the Roosevelt recession, this collapse. What was he
Let me
up
ask you
against?
this, if you can stop for a second.
You pick up that second term story then. What?
Yeah. In the second term, you also had opposition solidifying. Now, going back to the first term, you had lots of cries of socialism, anything that had to do with government intervention, whether it was in a works program under Harold Ickes or a relief program under Harry Hopkins, it was, by the opposition, creeping socialism or rampant socialism, depending on how you looked at it, and these were the terms used. Beginning in the second term, it took on a very ugly tone and picked up the very ingrained traditional anti-communism in this country, an anti-communism which is very much at a visceral level. It seems to be in the veins of this country. And it took the form of attacks on individual people in the government. Granted, people who are liberals. And it also was hot on the trail of the people who, left-wing persons who worked in government, who, out of intellectual conviction, belonged to a Communist Party cell. People like my grandmother had worked enough in the field to have no illusions about who really controlled the Communist Party, and that it wasn't a movement of the people and never had been. But a lot of people of strong liberal convictions saw the Communist Party as a viable alternative. Not great numbers of people, but they tended to be professional, intellectual, and they quite often had a job in government.
What did FDR? Was he afraid of communism? Did he have that strong streak of anti-communism himself?
I can only remember clearly in my childhood the fact that communism was discussed, but there was not in my family a fear of communism. It wasn't some bogey in the closet. It was a straightforward political power that was not controlled locally, and that it was fairly clear indication that it was controlled from Moscow. There was not that fear of communism, which unfortunately remained rampant in this country and was then given full expression during the McCarthy era.
Okay, great. Can we cut?
There were a lot of snide remarks about the New Deal and having a lot of Jews in Washington. I know no statistics about this, but this was what was said, and it cultivated, like the socialist and communist issues, it cultivated an undercurrent of anti-Semitism.
Sorry, I've got to, we gotta get.
One of the snide things, more said through the back of the hand than openly, about the New Deal was that so many Jews were now in Washington, or in the more anti-Semitic, were now running Washington. I don't know any statistics. I doubt that there were any more Jews than in other administrations. I don't know. But it was one of those things that was said, and it came out of, it sort of cultivated an undercurrent in American society that was anti-Semitic, which still continues in Europe, so it's not exactly unique to this country, not at all. My grandmother and grandfather were unaware of this. Some of their closest friends were Jews. Family on the Hudson River, our neighbors. He was Uncle Henry to me, and I'm referring to Henry Morgenthau Jr., who was Secretary of the Treasury, and his wife, Aunt Eleanor. But I know that it was fairly unique in the class that we came from to have close Jewish friends. Most people didn't. But that wasn't a unique situation. Look at the problems Disraeli had in English politics in the 1850s, and yet he became prime minister. I don't give it a lot of credibility, but since anti-Semitism and issues like the Holocaust came into such prominence after World War II, including refugee problems, it's worth mentioning. And it's worth mentioning maybe that FDR was unable to follow his wife in the very strong support for accommodating the children who had been orphaned, Jewish children who had been orphaned due to Hitler's invasion. And it was a touchy political issue, and it was, again, just like the anti-lynching law, something which FDR had to leave to the congressional leadership, and it failed of passage.
I'd like to now move on to the coming of war. You were living on the West Coast. Tell me what it was like as war came. What were you being told? What were your grandparents saying to your parents about?
Okay.
What dangers were you in?
Pearl Harbor stunned us, and I say that from personal experience. Even though I was, 11 years old, going on 12, I had some sense from what was dropped in conversation of the real disaster at Pearl Harbor, which most of the public was not aware of. They just knew it had been a disaster, but they didn't realize quite how devastating it was to the U.S. fleet and the number of people, American soldiers and sailors who had been killed, etc. There was real consideration of moving my sister and I back to Washington immediately, and my mother particularly, because if there had been a Japanese invasion at that time, the U.S. was in no way prepared militarily to defend its territory, and they could have walked in. A relatively small invasion could have taken over our area where I was living in the Pacific Northwest. So it was a very real physical threat. As it turned out, my sister and I joined my mother and stepfather in wanting to stay where we were. Perhaps we didn't realize the very real danger that we were in.
What kinds of things would go back and forth on the telephone or in letters? I mean, what were you being urged?
Well, it was on the telephone. It was that urgent to not just a family consideration. It was that FDR didn't want, nor certainly anybody in the military want, my mother or my sister and I particularly to be hostages in a concentration camp, used as bargaining chips in a situation. That would have been not a good scene. So it was a very practical consideration because of the threat of the invasion. And I don't think the Japanese realized, from a military point of view, just how vulnerable the U.S. was.
Why did FDR carry out the relocation of Japanese and Japanese American citizens at the time of the war? I mean, how did he understand it? How did he come to, support this act? And how did your grandmother respond differently? How did she struggle with it? Describe to me what happened and how and the expediency of it.
We're gonna have to pick that up.
Talk about the relocation.
Very early in World War II, by executive order, the Japanese, with no distinction but citizen or not citizen, who lived on the West Coast, primarily in California, but up and down the coast, were moved into camps under pretty horrible conditions inland. This was on the advice of the armed services because they were seriously concerned about a fifth column, a Trojan horse in the middle of the defense, and they were deeply concerned about the lack of preparedness to defend the land area of the United States on the West Coast. Clearly, in this day and age, we see it as unconstitutional and unconscionable, but at the time, as I remember it, it was not at all an unpopular measure with the U.S. population, U.S. voter. And in fact, I would go as far to say that if any other decision had been taken, that is to let them stay or draw a distinction between non-citizens will be drawn back, which has a legal basis, that it would have been very much open to political criticism. Now, there are all sorts of elements there, but the Japanese, being of a different race, are physically visible, whereas to look at the difference between a German or an Englishman or a Norwegian, it may be very difficult to know who is of German nationality. Alien Germans were rounded up. The German citizens were not rounded up at all. So you had a distinction made there, which I think you do have to say there was a racial bias. But in my opinion, FDR was in no position to go against his military advisors and would have been open to extremely strong criticism early in the war.
Was your grandmother comfortable with the policy?
My grandmother was very uncomfortable with the policy and went out and visited and commiserated and did her best to get the situations and the living conditions altered and alleviated and so forth, but she was unable to do very much, which would indicate that there was no political constituency in favor of the Japanese. It was just one of those tragic things that war brings about. And when you contrast it with the tremendous sense of mobilization, that it just got washed aside. And it is one of those tragedies that occurs in wartime to groups of people who are identified as the enemy.
Could you tell me about coming back to the White House during the war and how different the mood was from the time you had visited earlier, indeed lived there earlier?
My sister and I had left the White House to go live on the West Coast with my mother, who had remarried, and it was kind of tearful for us. It was our home, and while we went back to visit very frequently, I didn't move back to live there until World War II, and then the White House was a very, very changed place. What had been kind of happy, bumptious existence, it was now a wartime White House. Amenities were cut to a minimum. There was a kind of grimness and determination. And while with FDR there was always laughter, the whole scene had shifted to kind of a marching order. But it was the whole country involved in the marching order. There was a real sense of mobilization, of people working together like they hadn't done since the early days of the New Deal. And people dropped their differences and got under the same banner. It's difficult to describe because you're building upon a kind of patriotism which doesn't exist today. It's when people really took seriously the flag, and it isn't just burning the flag, but you didn't let the flag touch the floor. I mean, there was a kind of response to your country and to all of the symbols of your country, the anthems, the flags, the whatever. These were things that were taken very seriously and charged people. People were able to draw strength from them, to serve long hours, to go to work in factories that they'd never worked in before. Rosie the Riveter, the women who joined the ranks of the working force for the first time, really, in wide range of places in industry on the factory line, and did so out of patriotic motivation. A scene which I guess anybody who has no personal recollection of World War II would find extremely foreign and might as well have happened in the 18th century.
That for a second. Tell me about Perkins.
Long before the civil rights movement, as we know it, got started, my grandmother had a very real concern for the discrimination against whites. You didn't have just...
You said against whites.
The discrimination that she had...
Just start from the very beginning.
Long before the civil rights movement, as we know it, got started, my grandmother had a very real concern with the discrimination against blacks. The signs, whites only, the separate entrances to the public toilets for blacks and whites, the whole range of things where blacks were discriminated against, where you didn't have any kind of political meeting in the South. Incidentally, not just in the South, but in border states and far west as well. You'd have whites-only meeting, then you'd have a meeting of the black constituency. And when my grandmother was in, I think it was Alabama, there was a meeting which had taken a major step forward of having blacks and whites together. But they'd put the blacks on one side of the room and the whites on the other side of the room. And this made her extremely uncomfortable. She picked up her chair and set it down in the corridor, the passageway between the two, and sat down. highly symbolic. But here you really have to understand something about her. It was not a grand gesture. It was her way of getting out of an awkward situation. It was totally practical and pragmatic for her. And being who she was, it made a statement that she could not have put into words.
Did she do it for publicity?
I don't think she ever wrote about it. I do remember her commenting about it, over the supper table, sort of a story that got about it. I think she was quite pleased with her ingenuity. Publicity was not something she sought.
You should stop. How?
She spoke about this incident, but more amused at her own ingenuity of getting out of an awkward situation, one she felt keenly to demonstrate. But it was not publicity, and she in no way used it at her press conferences or any other. She did not seek publicity. She didn't need to.
That's great. Okay, cut. That's a wrap, unless there's something else you'd like to tell us, if you haven't.